Hello, in this lecture we'll be covering natural selection, built-in behavior like reflexes and modal action patterns, and we'll be defining and discussing learning, and what learning is. The first step is to recognize that the world is constantly changing. If we look at this graphic, we can see that even something that we tend to take for granted, like the face of the Earth, has changed dramatically over millions of years. And with those changes, we also see changes to the life forms that exist on the planet, moving from protozoa 750 million years ago up to ants around 80 million years ago, and finally to all human civilization existing really in just a portion of that black line at the very top of the Cenozoic period. I mean, we have only been on this planet for an extremely short amount of time. And I make this point only for us to recognize that when we're talking about time and we're talking about change, we need to take a really big, wide worldview on this and realize that we're talking about deep time and a long time. But what it comes down to is that the history of life is all about coping with these constantly changing environments. Now, how does life change as the environment changes? These changes in the environment produce changes in species. These changes occur across generations. They don't occur within a generation, but across generations. And this type of change and the mechanism of this change is known as natural selection. Now, I recommend that you pause the lecture at this point and watch the video. You can either watch it as it is embedded in the slide, just click on it and it will play, or you can click on the link at the bottom and watch it through the YouTube player. Either way, I recommend that you pause the presentation at this point and view this video before moving on. Now, referring to the video, there were 5 basic observations and assumptions of natural selection that I'd like to walk through one at a time. The first is that natural selection assumes that animals reproduce. This, I think, is an observation. We know this. We know that animals reproduce. The second is that the traits are passed on. That is, the traits by the parents are passed on to their offspring. And third, that there is variation in the traits. So the offspring aren't clones of their parents, but instead gain a combination of traits. Again, these are things that are observations. We know these things. We can see these things in the world around us. When we talk about variation in traits, though, we're not only talking about variation in terms of the traits that an individual receives from their parents, but we also need to look at it at a species level, how the traits are dispersed amongst the species. And to do this, we need to think about these traits as existing on a bell curve or a normal distribution. And so, for example, on a normal distribution, we might think of the trait of, say, hairiness. And that trait can vary from being essentially having no hair on the left-hand side to having a ton of hair on the right-hand side. But most members of the species are going to be somewhere in the middle. And the same is true for any other types of traits we might discuss, like body size or the production of a particular hormone. And so we need to think about these traits existing in the species along some curve of variability. Next, now some assumptions. Fitness. Fitness is the idea that some traits enhance the likelihood of survival and reproduction. And what that means is that some of these traits that we inherit make us better able to fit an environmental niche. That is, that given the state of the environment at this time, some traits make us fit better, allow us to exploit the environment better than other traits. So in other words, or equally, some traits may make an animal more sexually attractive to its conspecifics than other traits. At the same token, then, if some traits make an animal a better fit, that means that some make an animal a less good fit. And so, thereby would reduce the likelihood of the survival and reproduction of that individual. Now, that is just, all we're doing is we're saying that across variations, some of these traits are better for this particular environment than others. The last step, then, is the step of selection. Enhancing traits are more likely to be passed on to the next generation. If an animal is living in a cold environment, then more hair is going to be a better insulator and make that animal more likely to survive. If it's more likely to survive, then it's more likely to reproduce and more likely to pass that trait of hairiness on to its offspring. And if we think about that on the scale not just of one individual but of a species, then we can see how the trait of hairiness in that cold environment would be passed on, and that the species across generations would become more and more hairy. If we accept that physical traits can be passed on from parent to offspring, what about behavioral traits? Does the way we behave depend on our genes as well? And a critical experiment on this was the farm fox experiment, which began back in 1959 in Russia. The driving question behind this experiment was, what would it take for an animal like a dog to be domesticated? And so they began this experiment with 130 foxes that they had acquired from a fur farm. So these were not tame foxes. They were essentially wild, not as wild perhaps as foxes that hadn't been in kennels, but still these were not tame by any means. You could not handle these foxes. But what they did is they selected, they developed a behavioral task and then selected foxes based on how tame they were rated based on that behavioral assessment, which you will see in the videos above. So what they did then is that the foxes that showed the least amount of tameness, or were the most avoidant of humans, those were selected and bred, and they continued to show that human avoidance despite the fact that generation after generation of doing this, they were surrounded by people, they saw people every day, but they continued to be very avoidant of people. Interestingly, the foxes, when they were selected as just being less avoidant of people, essentially, they weren't tame by any means, but they were less avoidant. But they selected those, allowed them to breed, tested the offspring. The offspring that were the least avoidant of people were then selected and allowed to breed, and so on and so forth. And 10 generations later, 18%, that's 1 in 5 of the foxes, were considered very tame. So at this point, pause the lecture and watch each of the behavioral assessments, the videos that are embedded in this slide. You'll see the assessment, like how the behavioral assessment took place, and you can see the behavior of the foxes. See if you can tell which of the two is the tame fox. Resume the slide after you've watched the videos. Now, this graphic is just showing the clustering of the scores. I don't really want to focus too much on the details here, but we can see that this is looking at the behavioral score of the foxes who had tame parents versus foxes of aggressive parents. The tame parents are the dots. The ones with aggressive parents are the triangles. And really what I just want to focus on here is that although there is variability in their behavioral scores, so not all of the foxes with aggressive parents were equally aggressive, but there's a very clear clustering. where we can see that those with aggressive parents were overall more aggressive, and those with tame parents were overall more tame. So what this shows us then is that behavioral tendencies can be inherited. This next section will look at other types of behaviors that are innate and therefore subject to natural selection. The first we'll discuss is the reflex. What is a reflex? A reflex is a relationship between a specific event, known as a stimulus, and a very simple involuntary response. So keep in mind, a reflex is the relationship between the stimulus and response. The reflex is not just the response. It's the relationship.
You can elicit the Moreau reflex by having him relax, unsuspecting, and then give him a sudden stimulus, and there's a good Moreau. Quiet and headlight midline, and then just give the stimulus of dropping him back a few inches, and that's a good normal response. Okay.
So in this example, we see that the stimulus of dropping this newborn back a little bit is related to the response of the newborn flailing its arms out to its sides. Right? So that relationship between the stimulus of dropping and the response of jerking its arms out to the sides is the Moreau reflex. It's the relationship between those two. So we can think about this in terms of just a stimulus-response relationship. A stimulus, the S, causes the response or elicits the response. So there are lots of these that are built in at birth. So this is inborn behavior. It either is present at birth, like the rooting reflex, that when you touch a baby's cheek, they will turn toward the touch. The sucking reflex, you put something in the baby's mouth and they will immediately begin sucking on it. And the grasping reflex, you put your fingers in a baby's palm and they'll grab on. It's often thought that, oh, the baby loves me, but in reality it's just a reflex. The baby can't help it. These reflexes then are either present at birth or they develop at specific developmental stages. So as one matures, they occur naturally and they occur in all members of the species. What's important to note here is that these responses are all very simple responses. They're simple, they're involuntary. All right? They consist of muscle jerks, like the baby's arms jerking out to its sides in the Moreau reflex, and they consist of glandular secretions. So basically you can remember this as reflex responses consists of jerks and squirts. What do reflexes do? Well, reflexes essentially serve and protect us. So these are built-in mechanisms that serve and protect. They protect us from pain. They protect us from things that might hurt us, essentially. They also serve us in the sense that a baby with all of these reflexes working is much more likely to be successful at nursing and eating than one that maybe did not have the rooting, sucking, and salivation and swallowing reflexes functioning. They would have a much more difficult time eating. Sometimes, though, these reflexes might provide some overprotection or some disservice. So an example of this is allergies. Allergens, the pollen itself is not something that is harmful to us. It's our reaction to the pollen that is harmful. Right? Peanuts are not dangerous to us, but someone's reaction to peanuts might be very harmful to them. And these reactions, these allergic reactions, are considered to be reflexive. They're involuntary, and the hormone production is a secretion, and it occurs when that pollen or that allergen is detected. But it is essentially a disservice. It's a danger to the one who has that allergy. Another note here is that reflexes are stereotypic. That means that they happen the same way every time. The same stimulus produces the same response every time. Every time you're at the doctor's office and they tap on your patellar tendon on your knee, right? Your leg kicks. At no point when they tap on your knee will you salivate or anything else. It's always going to be the same response. And then lastly, since these behaviors, these reflexes are built in, that means that they are subject to natural selection. That means that they will persist in the species to the extent that they don't get in the way of the species' survival. If they do get in the way of the species' survival, then those individuals that have that trait, that have that reflex, would be less likely to survive and reproduce, and so that trait would be less likely to be passed on. Another example of a built-in behavior is the modal action pattern. Modal action patterns are similar to reflexes, except that they are more complex. We're talking about now a stimulus that elicits a series of interrelated acts. These are also known as fixed action patterns, species-specific behavior, and instincts. As I said, there's a releasing stimulus. So just like with a reflex, there is a stimulus that elicits a simple involuntary response. With modal action patterns, there is a stimulus called a releaser or a releasing stimulus that elicits the pattern of behavior. And this is a behavior that is much more complex than a reflex. So let's look at some examples. I think that will make this more clear. The first are mating and courtship rituals. So here's an example of a bird of paradise that has cleaned out an area in which to dance. The females, when they arrive on the branch above, are the releasing stimulus. When they arrive, the male begins his dance. And he engages in this same dance every time females appear. If a female sticks around to the end of the dance, mating ensues. If the females see that dance and are not enthralled and they leave, then mating does not ensue. But this is something that is not taught. This is built-in behavior. And from their first mating season as adults, birds of paradise engage in this behavior. Another example is the care of young, egg retrieval. So here we'll see another video that demonstrates this. Here is a goose. You can see the goose tending to its nest, covering its eggs. Now what we'll see is a researcher will pull one of those eggs out of the nest and off to the side. So they've pulled the eggs out, and we see the goose pull the eggs back in under itself into the nest. Now it looks like a very caring mother goose, but if we see the researcher pull the egg away as it returns the egg, we see the behavior actually continues on. The goose doesn't react to the egg being pulled away. Instead, it persists through the behavior. This behavior of egg retrieval is a modal action pattern. And once it gets started, as with all modal action patterns, once they're started, it's this chain of behaviors that persists all the way through until the end. So it's not so much that this is a caring mother goose. On the contrary, this is a behavior that is built into this goose, and it can't stop itself, essentially, from doing this. Here's another example. We'll watch just a little bit of this, seeing that it doesn't even matter that it's an egg out there. You can put cue balls and various other items, and the goose will retrieve those as if they were eggs. All that's required is that an object
needn't be white, or even egg-shaped.
Yeah, all that's required is that an object egg-like be outside of the nest, and they will retrieve it.
Warbler dropped her egg into this nest. Now the young cuckoo hatches as the first of the brood. The reed warbler did not notice the trick, and now feeds the young as if it were its own. The young cuckoo needs to throw the other. If it doesn't do this, then the parents will not be able to feed all the nestlings. But the first attempts are not
So
successful.
here we're seeing
The cuckoo.
the built-in behavior of a cuckoo as it attempts to
push
push
the
the
egg above
eggs.
the edge of the nest. It is a big effort.
But clearly this is not a behavior that the cuckoo has learned, as it is a new hatchling.
The
But it is
determination
nevertheless
of
a
the weak cuckoo
built-in,
nestlings to
fairly
get rid of the
complex
competition
behavior.
is amazing to see.
You can pause the lecture now and just continue to let this video go.
After a few hours, it has another go. This time, there's some success. The first.
So,
When it throws
what about
out the
humans?
second egg,
Do humans have
the
modal action
cuckoo
patterns?
almost.
Well, there have been a lot of ideas about perhaps humans having modal action patterns. Self-preservation, maternal instinct, courting behavior, etc. However, as it turns out, none of these things are behaviorally stereotypic, meaning that we don't, across cultures, we don't engage in these behaviors in the same way. We now know very well the maternal instinct is not a real thing, that new mothers who did not have experience with children when they were younger have a much more difficult time adjusting to motherhood than those who maybe had younger siblings that they helped to take care of, or did a lot of babysitting or things like that when they were younger. And so, in other words, this maternal instinct, this idea that once you have a baby you'll immediately know what to do, that, as it turns out, is not true at all. So it is generally accepted that humans do not have modal action patterns. What we do have, and many other animals do have, are general behavior traits. So these are traits that they tend to vary across individuals within the species, but there is a lot of consistency. So they occur in a wide variety of situations. That, unlike a reflex or a modal action pattern, there isn't a very specific releaser. It's a more of a general releaser. So, for example, aversive stimuli tend to produce aggressive behavior. The chart is showing an example of that as the temperature outside goes up and gets into the uncomfortable zone of in the 90s, we see a rise in violent crime. So, and this has been demonstrated in other experiments. If you put a bunch of people in a room and you increase the temperature in the room, people tend to be shorter tempered with each other and be more aggressive. Keep in mind that aggressive behavior can take a lot of different forms. So one type of aversive stimulus is heat, temperature, right? But that's only one. We can also have uncomfortable clothes or any number of things that are aversive. Aggressive behavior can take many different forms. We can be passive-aggressive, we can make snide comments, or we can be physically aggressive and go to fisticuffs, all of which would be considered to be aggressive behavior. So this isn't just saying that, that it increases crime. It increases even mild aggression amongst friends or partners. So what it comes down to then is that with general behavior traits, we see these general trends in behavior, but there's a lot more plasticity. That means a lot more variety than there is in a modal action pattern. So general behavior traits are not always the exact same response. Whereas with modal action patterns and reflexes, the releaser always produces the exact same response. So these are best described as behavior tendencies or temperaments. What we're looking at are traits, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, etc. These are all things that exist in people, but we vary in those traits, right? Some score higher or lower, but there's variability in those traits, but they're all there in all of us to some extent. We can think of it as being similar to the foxes. So the foxes that were selectively bred, right? The farm fox experiment. Their temperaments determined the extent to which they would approach people and how tame they were. But these were inherited temperaments. So an example with people is that humans tend to be social. We are social animals. Why might that be? Well, if an isolated ancestor, one who was a complete hermit, if they were not social at all, then that would mean that they had a much more difficult time surviving. And if they were truly asocial and spent no time with people, then that means that they definitely did not reproduce. And so any of those antisocial, in the sense of not being around people at all, traits would have not been passed on. Can natural selection account for everything that we do? Can we look at our genes as an explanation for all of our behavior? No. No, of course not. What are some examples? Or why is it that natural selection cannot account for all of our behavior? Well, first, natural selection is behind the times. When we're born, we got the genes that helped our parents survive. And they got the genes that helped their parents survive, right? But the genes that we got, they helped our ancestors survive. They may or may not help us survive in the environment as it is now, because the environments are constantly changing. And so genes that helped our great-great-great-grandparents survive, they may not work for us at this point in time, or may not work for us as well as they did for our ancestors. Natural selection works across generations. It doesn't work at the level of the individual. So when there are abrupt changes to an environment, then natural selection is too slow to keep up with those changes. Think about polar bears right now, as the ice is decreasing, their hunting season is decreasing with global climate change. Then their numbers are dwindling. And it's unlikely that changes, as they are not rapid breeders, it's unlikely that there will be enough time for them to, for natural selection to change polar bears in such a way that they can keep up with the abrupt changes to their environment. So to some extent, we can think of ourselves as hostages of our genes. And there is some truth to that. Let's look at a couple of examples. Humans evolved in a world in which salt and sugar were difficult to come by. But both of them are necessary for our survival. We need salt. It's an electrolyte. Our neurons require it to function. We need sugar. It's fuel. That's our energy that we burn. We need those things to survive. So our ancestors, who had a strong taste preference for saltiness and for sweet, were more likely to survive than our ancestors who did not have that preference. So the result of that is that now we like salty things and we like sweet things. That worked really well for our ancestors, but now we can get salt and sugar around almost any corner. It's incredibly prevalent in our society, and the result of that is that we tend to overeat those things, which can produce heart problems and obesity. Another example is sexual appetite. Prior to the medical revolution, most people died before ever reaching adulthood. So the way to combat that was to start having babies early and frequently. So those individuals with a high sexual appetite that kicked in as soon as they were mature were more likely to have offspring that might survive and then also be able to reproduce and pass on their genes. Of course, with modern medicine, with food production now, mortality rates have decreased. More people reach adulthood, and the result of that is a dramatic increase in world population. So, if we are to change our behavior to deal with things like diabetes, type 2, obesity, all kinds of health issues that are behavior related, and bigger issues like pollution and overpopulation, then we must change our behavior. We must learn. So, what is learning? Learning is a change in behavior due to experience. That is our definition. Let me walk through the definition, these highlighted points. So, a change. We're talking about learning as a change in behavior, not just an acquisition of behavior. We tend to think about behavior or learning as acquiring something new. And that certainly is one type of learning, but we can also learn to do something less often, right? We may have smoked and then we learn to stop doing that. We may have drank a lot of alcohol and we have learned to not do that as much. So that too are examples of learning. So it's not only about acquiring new behavior, but it's also about stopping other behavior. What is behavior? Well, behavior is anything that an organism does that can be measured. It doesn't have to necessarily be seen with the naked eye, it just has to be measured. So by that definition, that means that we can use, if we can use an fMRI scan and see neural activity, that activity could count as behavior. Keep in mind, though, it has to pass what is called the dead man test. If a dead man can do it, it isn't behavior. So, lying down is not behavior. Sitting is not behavior. Being quiet is not behavior, right? It needs to be something that is an action. We're also talking about behavior itself. We're not talking about some sort of change in cognitive structures or some sort of change in the nervous system. The behavior is the thing that is measured. It is the action itself. And we're looking at changes in behavior. They are what learning is, right? So, as the definition says, learning is a change in behavior due to experience. We're not saying that learning is a change in cognitive structures that produce a change in behavior. That is a different model. That's the cognitive model or the medical model. From this model, from this perspective, learning is the change in behavior itself. And then lastly, the notion of experience is, how do we define experience? Well, that is exposure to physical events, exposure to stimuli. These events or stimuli are any sort of change that takes place in the environment. What this brings us to then is recognizing that learning is a biological mechanism. This is a built-in mechanism which copes with changes in the environment within the lifetime of the individual. So, in other words, the ability to learn was naturally selected, right? That's something that we got, that we received in our genes. We inherited that ability. So it picks up where natural selection leaves off. Natural selection gives organisms, animals, reflexes, modal action patterns, tendencies. All of these things have been tested generation after generation. So the ones that we have gotten are the ones that have worked. But what learning does is it allows individuals to cope with the environment that they are in, the immediate environment. The current environment is not exactly the same as the ancestors' environment. Think about how much our world is different from the world that your grandparents grew up in. It's changed a lot, and our ability to cope with those changes comes down to our ability to learn. So this ability to learn then is an evolved ability. It's an inherited ability. So we can think about learning as evolved modifiability. Now this brings us back to a topic that we touched on in the Module 0 lecture, this nature versus nurture issue. Now, to some extent, this is an artificial dichotomy. Genes or nature produce the structure, they produce the body, right? The mechanisms. The environment or nurture affects how that body develops. So genes that are there require an environment to turn them on and activate them. So learning depends on heredity, having the ability to do it, and the experience, the opportunity to engage in things and be exposed to things. So, for example, in this experiment, they looked at rats raised in different environments and then looked at the brain cells and compared them across rats that were brought up in a standard cage in which they just had food, water, a conspecific, and that's it, versus rats that were brought up in an enriched cage in which they had food and water, another rat, and a whole bunch of stuff to play in. And what they found is that rats that were reared in the simple cage had less brain mass than rats that were reared in a complex cage. What this demonstrates then is this relationship between nature and nurture. Nature is essentially a potential, right? The genes provide potential. Nurture releases that potential. So this gets into questions of, how does a child develop? Well, does that depend on their genes? Yes, certainly it does, but it also depends a lot on the interaction that that child has and the experiences that that child has growing up. So in summary, we are biological and environmental organisms. That is, we are the product of both nature and nurture. So we're products of our genes, we're products of our environments. Heredity and learning are both part of the same process, and that's that process of coping with an ever-changing environment. Thank you.